Okay, let's take a look at this. A U.S. Department of State report alleges that some South African prosecutors, police officers and an acting judge have been implicated in human trafficking. Some of the key findings in the report include trafficking from neighboring countries as well as rural parts of South Africa. The victims include women and children who are forced into sex work, mining and domestic work, among others. Heather Merritt is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the United States Embassy, and she joins us now to expand on this report. Heather, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Let's start with how the report or the research was put together.
So every year we do have a process around the world to gather information from governments and from partner organizations, from international organizations, about the status of human trafficking in more than 180 countries around the world, including the United States. The reports process takes into account great work done by civil society and by the media in uncovering cases, as well as information from government records and government-to-government conversations. It's compiled. The standard that we use for drafting the report is a U.S. act of our Congress called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. And we do this to really highlight the cause of modern human slavery, to bring attention to the challenges, and to rally increased efforts around the world, including in my own country, the United States.
So the report starts by noting that the government of South Africa does not fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking, but is making significant efforts to do so. And South Africa has been characterized as Tier 2 of the watch list. We'll get into the watch list in a few moments. But what is it that the government is not doing to fully meet the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking?
One of the standards in the report, and again, this is spelled out in U.S. law and the TVPA, that's where those standards come from, although they do line up with international accords, including those parts of the UN Convention Against Organized Crime that South Africa, the United States, and other countries have signed on to that are relevant to human trafficking. But just to say that one of the requirements is to see an increased effort, including with regard to what we call the 3 Ps, to prosecution of offenders, to protection of victims, and also to prevention of future acts of trafficking. And while there were some increases here in prosecutions, there were also other areas in which the numbers were reduced, such as in offering protection and shelters to victims and some other things. And so it's a picture that you'll see more details about in the report. But I think the issue is really seeing those efforts increase. I want to say that we've had a lot of great cooperation with government of South Africa, with civil society here. I would particularly commend the efforts of some of our colleagues at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, as well as NPA, Deputy Minister John Jeffrey and Advocate Sue Paul at DOJ-CD are particular leaders in this area, as well as Advocate Karen Kutsi from NPA. So we really are seeing effort, but it was a question of the statistics and the prosecutions, the protection efforts increasing year on year. I think we saw also a trend in which some of the shelters that victims were receiving in past years lost accreditation, and so perhaps there were some gaps in victim protection that can be addressed moving forward.
Speaking of the gaps in victim protection, the report notes that law enforcement lacks sufficient resources and training to adequately and appropriately investigate all reported trafficking cases, oftentimes conflating GBV and human trafficking crimes. How so?
So I think it's difficult sometimes if you're a frontline protector, somebody who is working in the field with cases coming in the door. One of the key differences between, say, a GBV case and trafficking is this element of force, fraud, and coercion. Sometimes there's a misunderstanding that trafficking has to involve movement or movement across borders. But under the definitions internationally and under the U.S. TVPA, anyone who is forced into labor or into sexual activity by use of force, fraud, or coercion could be a victim of trafficking. And so it could be that a case presents as someone who comes in as a victim, perhaps of abuse, being beaten. There might be an element of domestic abuse, but if you look further and investigate deeper, you might find that that woman, for example, was forced into commercial sex work, and that the person who beat her is a trafficker, not just an intimate partner. So that's what the difference would be.
Okay. The report, or rather you mentioned the word statistics and you also mentioned the word force. The report notes that the custom of ukutwala may contribute to the vulnerability of girls and women. You found that some 500,000 children in 2021 dropped out of school. 750,000 were not enrolled in school, meaning that they were left vulnerable to human trafficking. What should we understand about this?
So I'm not an expert in that practice, nor was I the author of the report, so I don't know that I can go into that detail, but I think what we can take away at a larger level is that adolescent girls are a particularly vulnerable group. Adolescent girls, especially with the growth of some of the online scams, can be vulnerable to being coerced or defrauded into forced labor or commercial sex work around the world, and it's a group we should put additional effort into trying to protect.
So parents should actually know what their children are getting up to on the phones.
Parents should absolutely know what they're getting up to on their phones.
Yeah.
That is true.
So when you speak of Tier 2 watch list, what does that mean?
So Tier 2 watch list is an indicator that South Africa has been on Tier 2 for a certain number of years. This is actually the third year that South Africa is on the watch list. Watch list indicates that there would be a danger of dropping to the next tier, Tier 3, if additional efforts were not made. But I don't think it's important so much to focus on the tiers. I think what's really important is the way that this report gives us a tool to work together as partners. We often talk in trafficking about 3 Ps, about, as I mentioned earlier, prosecutions, protection, and prevention. But the 4th P, the more important P, is partnership. And that can include partnership between national and provincial government, partnership with civil society organizations, and of course, international partnerships. I think what I want to focus on is the way that the U.S. and South Africa are partnering together, whether that's across civil society organizations or our law enforcement entities or diplomats, to try to identify what can be better in the trafficking space, not just here in South Africa, but in the United States and around the world. And we are working together really closely with South Africa, and I think that will show in the numbers in future reports.
Okay, what does that partnership look like? What does it involve?
Well, I mean, for example, in my embassy, we have a number of law enforcement attachés who are here from the Department of Homeland Security or the FBI. It's their day-to-day work sharing case information and tips with SAPs and NPA and relevant law enforcement partners. It's work and funding that sometimes we're able to provide to the really important civil society organizations that are doing the day-to-day work in protection and prevention, particularly, where they're identifying vulnerable people, they're providing shelter to someone who perhaps was rescued from trafficking, and they're helping them get on their feet and out of that victimization. Those are really important pieces of our partnership. And we work together diplomatically as well. As I said, we've had great conversations between our U.S. officials and DIRCO and the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, NPA, other players here.
So does it look the same with the South African Embassy in the United States, where you've got attachés or people from the Hawks or the NPA, etc.?
It certainly does. I don't know that NPA in particular is located in the South African Embassy. I would have to check on that. But often our embassies overseas incorporate trade attachés, military attachés, law enforcement attachés. It's a symbol of the really robust and deep partnership between the U.S. and South Africa that we have such a robust interagency presence to really work on all aspects of the U.S.-South African partnership.
Heather, thank you for your time this
Thanks
afternoon.
So much,
Heather Merritt is the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy.